They say memory fades with age, but what if the mind remembers more than it reveals? William Hartman, once a brilliant professor, now sat in his study, his wrinkled hands tracing the pages of an old notebook. His sons believed he was lost, consumed by forgetfulness, and perhaps part of him was. But as they laughed behind his back, calling him senile and out of touch, William kept a secret. He wasn't losing his mind. He was hiding it, waiting for the right moment to unveil a final truth, a truth that would shake his sons to their core. What they thought was an old man's ramblings was something far more dangerous, a final lesson, hidden in a book they would never expect. And as they ignored their father's silent struggle, they had no idea how close they were to losing everything they held dear. This is the story of William Hartman's last promise, one that would haunt his children forever. William Hartman sat by the window of his aging study, watching the shadows lengthen across the lawn of his once grand estate. He was 82 now, and his body had begun to betray him in ways that felt like the slow theft of time. His hands trembled when he reached for the cup of tea that had grown cold. His vision blurred when he tried to read the familiar books lining the shelves. And worst of all, his memory, once sharp and unyielding, seemed to flicker in and out like a dying light bulb. Or so everyone thought. To his sons, Daniel and Robert, William had become a relic of the past, a man who was once great, but now teetered on the edge of irrelevance. They visited, of course, but their visits felt more like obligatory check-ins rather than genuine attempts to connect with their father. To them, their father's once brilliant mind was fading into obscurity, lost to the fog of old age. But William was far more aware than they realized. As Daniel and Robert drove up the gravel path leading to the house that day, William sat back in his chair, folding his trembling hands in his lap. He knew this visit wasn't out of concern for his well-being. No, it was something else. His sons had grown predictable in their distance, their carefully concealed impatience seeping through their thin smiles and half-hearted conversations. Daniel, the elder of the two, was a successful corporate lawyer, always in a hurry. His life was a whirlwind of high-stakes deals and court appearances, leaving little time for anything or anyone else. To the outside world, Daniel was a model of success, polished, confident, and driven. But to William, he was an enigma, a son who had once been close but now seemed more concerned with appearances than with family. His visits were rare, and when he did come, his eyes always drifted towards his phone, as though he was counting the minutes until he could leave. Robert, on the other hand, was softer, quieter, and in many ways more complicated. He had followed his own path into academia, becoming a professor of philosophy at a prestigious university. Yet for all his intellectual pursuits, Robert remained emotionally distant, rarely opening up or expressing any sentiment beyond polite curiosity. He would sit with his father, nodding at William's stories, but his thoughts seemed to drift elsewhere, as though he too was always waiting for something else. As the brothers stepped out of their cars, Daniel tugged at his suit jacket, and Robert shoved his hands into the pockets of his worn-out coat. They exchanged a look, an unspoken agreement that this visit was a necessary inconvenience. Neither of them had noticed how the garden their mother once lovingly tended had now grown wild, or how the grand old house seemed to sag under the weight of years. To them, the estate was just another reminder of a legacy they would one day inherit, a relic from a life they barely connected to anymore. William heard the sound of their footsteps approaching and straightened his posture. He knew they would knock lightly on the door, not out of respect, but out of habit. And just as he predicted, there it was, a soft, hesitant knock. "Come in," William called, his voice steady. The door creaked open, and the brothers stepped inside. The room felt heavy with silence, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock that had stood in the corner for as long as they could remember. Daniel was the first to speak, his tone brisk, almost businesslike. "Dad, how are you doing?" he asked, his eyes scanning the room as if he was looking for something specific. William smiled faintly. He had learned to recognize Daniel's tone, a mix of obligation and impatience. It was as though Daniel was always asking questions, but never really interested in the answers. "I'm fine," William replied, his voice soft but sure. "How are the two of you?" Robert shifted awkwardly, his eyes briefly meeting his father's before settling on the bookshelves. He cleared his throat before answering, "Busy, as usual. Classes are full this semester." "Good," William said with a nod, though he could feel the distance between them growing with each word. It had been like this for years, small talk, empty conversations that masked a much deeper estrangement. The brothers took their usual places in the sitting room, Daniel by the window, fidgeting with his phone, and Robert sinking into the old leather chair, his eyes glazed over as if he were somewhere else entirely. William watched them for a moment, his heart heavy with the weight of all that had gone unsaid between them. It wasn't that they didn't care. It was more that they didn't know how to care in the way that mattered. They had been so consumed by their own lives, their own successes, that they had forgotten what it meant to be a family. "I've been working on something," William said suddenly, breaking the silence. His words were carefully chosen, designed to spark their curiosity, even if only for a moment. Daniel glanced up from his phone, his eyebrows raised. "Oh? What is it?" William paused, savoring the slight flicker of interest in his son's voice. "A new book," he replied, his tone casual, but there was a hint of something deeper beneath the surface. Robert leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "A book? I thought you'd stopped writing years ago." William smiled faintly. "Yes, I did, but I've had a bit of inspiration lately. Thought it might be time to write again." Both sons exchanged glances, not quite sure what to make of their father's sudden burst of creativity. For years, William had been known as a celebrated writer, his books hailed for their insight and wisdom. But as his health declined, so too did his writing, or at least that's what they believed. "What's it about?" Daniel asked, though his voice lacked genuine curiosity. He was already calculating how long this conversation might take, his mind drifting back to the emails and messages waiting on his phone. William's eyes twinkled with a secret he wasn't ready to share just yet. "You'll see," he said, his voice low and mysterious. "When it's finished, you'll understand." The brothers fell silent, unsure of how to respond. There was something in their father's tone that felt different, something they couldn't quite place. But before they could ask any more questions, William shifted the conversation back to them. "How's work, Daniel? Still chasing those big deals?" Daniel shrugged, his expression tight. "Always. You know how it is." "And Robert, how are the students treating you?" Robert gave a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Same as always, just trying to get through the semester." William nodded, but his mind was already drifting elsewhere. He could see the impatience in Daniel's posture, the distance in Robert's gaze. They were here, but not really. And it was in these moments that William realized just how much they had grown apart. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He had one last promise to fulfill. And whether they knew it or not, Daniel and Robert were about to become a part of it. As the brothers made their excuses and prepared to leave, William watched them go with a knowing smile. They had no idea what was coming. They thought they knew their father, a fading old man who had long since passed his prime. But William had been preparing something they would never expect. And when the time came, they would have no choice but to confront the truth, a truth that would change everything. As the door clicked shut behind Daniel and Robert, William remained seated, staring out the window at the old oak tree that stood tall in the yard. It had been there for as long as he could remember, rooted in place, weathering the storms and seasons just as he had. But unlike the tree, his branches had weakened, and the roots that once connected him to his family had grown thin. The silence in the house was palpable, pressing in on him like an unwanted guest. William's thoughts wandered back to a time when this house was filled with laughter, warmth, and the unbreakable bond of family. There were moments, bright and vivid, when Daniel and Robert were children, when life hadn't yet pulled them apart. He remembered the summers when they would run through the garden, their laughter echoing through the air as he and his wife, Margaret, sat on the porch, watching them with joy. Margaret had always been the heart of the family, her gentle smile and nurturing spirit binding them together. But after she passed, something shifted. The glue that held their family together had disappeared, and in its place grew a silent, invisible distance. What had really changed after Margaret's death? William wondered if he had failed as a father, or if Daniel and Robert had simply lost their way in the pursuit of success. The question gnawed at him, unresolved, a shadow that haunted the edges of his thoughts. Had they become so absorbed in their own lives that they no longer recognized the man who had given everything for them? The memory of Margaret's funeral was still clear in his mind. It was the last time he had seen both his sons cry, a rare, unguarded moment when they allowed themselves to be vulnerable. They had clung to him then, their grief raw and real. But as time passed, that vulnerability hardened into something else. Daniel, always the one to put on a brave face, threw himself into his work as if success could shield him from pain. Robert, with his philosophical mind, retreated inward, seeking solace in books and abstract ideas, avoiding any real emotional connection. Was this how they coped, or was it something more? William had often wondered whether their distance was a result of losing their mother, or if there was something deeper, something he had missed. A failure on his part as a father? He recalled one summer, years ago, when Robert had just graduated from college. The family had gathered for a small celebration, and for a moment, everything had felt like it used to. Whole. Robert had given a speech, thanking his parents for their support, and William could see the pride in Margaret's eyes as they stood together, arm in arm. They had felt invincible then, a family that would always endure. But now those moments felt like echoes from another life. Daniel and Robert no longer sought their father's approval or comfort. They were men of their own worlds now, worlds where William no longer had a place. The slow decay of their relationship wasn't sudden, it was gradual, like erosion, unnoticed until the landscape had changed beyond recognition. William had tried to reach out over the years. After Margaret's passing, he had made an effort to stay close, to keep that connection alive. But with each passing year, the phone calls became shorter, the visits less frequent. Daniel always had an excuse. "I've got this big case, Dad, you know how it is." And Robert, well, he was always busy with his students, his papers, his endless academic pursuits. The last time William had asked Daniel to stay for dinner, he had watched the hesitation in his son's eyes, followed by the polite decline. "Sorry, Dad, I have a meeting early tomorrow. Next time, okay?" But the next time never seemed to come, and it was in these small moments of rejection that William had felt his heart break, piece by piece. The sons he had once known, the boys who had clung to him when they were scared or needed guidance, were gone, replaced by men who barely saw him anymore. It wasn't always this way, he reminded himself. There was a time when Daniel would come to him for advice, when Robert would sit with him in the study, discussing philosophy and life, eager to hear his father's thoughts. But those days were long gone, buried beneath layers of success and ambition. Had the pursuit of their own dreams blinded them to the reality of their family? William stood up slowly, his knees aching from the years of wear. He walked over to the bookshelf and ran his fingers along the spines of the books he had read so many times. They were familiar friends, but even they couldn't fill the void that had grown inside him. He missed his sons, missed the men they used to be, the family they once had. He wasn't sure when things had started to change, but he could remember the first time he had truly felt the distance between them. It had been on a cold winter evening, shortly after Margaret had died. The house had felt emptier than usual, the kind of emptiness that seeps into your bones. Daniel had been on a business trip, and Robert had called to cancel his visit, citing some academic conference. William had sat alone that night, staring at the empty chair across from him, the chair that Margaret used to sit in. It was the first time he realized that his sons were slipping away from him, that their lives had taken a course that no longer included him in the way it once had. That realization had been a sharp, cold stab of loneliness, one that he hadn't been able to shake since. Even now, as he stood in the dim light of his study, the weight of that loneliness pressed down on him. But he wasn't bitter, not in the way some might expect. William didn't resent his sons for living their lives. He understood that they were chasing their dreams, just as he had once chased his. But what he couldn't understand was how they had forgotten the value of family, the importance of being there for the ones who had always been there for them. And that's what hurt the most. Not their absence, but the fact that they didn't even realize they were missing something. They didn't see the cracks forming in the foundation of their family, the cracks that William had tried so hard to mend. As he settled back into his chair, William's thoughts turned to the book he had been working on. It was a project he had started quietly, in the late hours of the night when the silence became too heavy to bear. The book wasn't just a story, it was a reflection of everything he had seen, everything he had felt over the years. It was his way of making sense of the distance between him and his sons, of trying to find some meaning in the estrangement that had grown between them. But the book wasn't just for him, it was for them. He wasn't writing it to publish or to gain recognition. He was writing it as a final message, a way to reach his sons in a way that words could no longer do. They wouldn't listen to him now, but maybe, just maybe, they would listen to his story. And when the time came, when the book was finished and his final chapter was written, he would leave it for them. But the question that haunted him was this: would they understand? Would they see what he had been trying to show them all along? Or would they remain blind to the truth, wrapped up in their own lives, unaware of the love they had left behind? William stared at the blank page in front of him, the words swirling in his mind, waiting to be put down. There was still time, he told himself. Time to finish the story. Time to leave behind the legacy that mattered. Not the estate, not the money, but the love that had always been there, even if his sons couldn't see it. As he picked up his pen, a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. He had one last promise to keep, and he intended to keep it. The night had fallen quietly around the estate, casting long shadows over the walls of William's study. The world outside had gone dark, but inside his mind was alive, racing with thoughts, memories, and a plan he had carefully crafted in the silence. As the hours stretched on, William found himself facing the task he knew he couldn't delay any longer. The final chapters of the book he had been secretly writing for months. This wasn't just any book, though. It wasn't a novel meant for the world, nor was it a reflection of his professional triumphs or personal philosophies. This book was for his sons. It was a message wrapped in metaphor, layered in stories they wouldn't fully understand at first. Stories of men not unlike themselves, lost in ambition, blind to the simple truths of love, family, and time. William knew that they wouldn't see it coming, that they had underestimated him. They thought his mind was failing, that he was slipping away. But in truth, he was more aware than ever. He had been watching them for years, noting their every move, their casual indifference, their hurried goodbyes. And now he was weaving it all into the fabric of his final work. The book was his last promise, a legacy more important than money or estates. It was the truth they had been avoiding, delivered in a way they couldn't escape. They would have to face it, every page, every word, and when they did, it would change everything. William sat down at his desk, the lamp casting a soft glow over the papers scattered in front of him. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up the pen, but his mind was sharp, his thoughts clear. He had spent the last year writing this story, pouring his heart into each chapter, constructing it piece by piece with the same precision he had once applied to his academic work. The only difference now was that this story wasn't about philosophy or literature. It was about life, about the mistakes people make and the lessons they refuse to learn. He had observed his sons carefully, every interaction, every dismissive glance, and had used their own actions to shape the characters in his story. They wouldn't realize it at first, but they were the ones he was writing about. And when the time came, they would have no choice but to confront the versions of themselves that he had created on the page. The pen hovered over the paper for a moment as William gathered his thoughts. The characters had already come to life in his mind. Two brothers, successful in their own right, but blind to the importance of what they were losing. One was driven by power and prestige, constantly chasing the next big deal, while the other was lost in intellectual pursuits, detached from the emotional connections that truly mattered. It was Daniel and Robert, of course, though they would never see it that way. Not at first. He began to write again, the ink flowing smoothly across the page. There were once two brothers, both born to a man of great wisdom and love. The father had built a life for them, had given them everything they needed to succeed, and yet as the years passed, they began to drift away from him. They believed they had outgrown their father, that their lives had taken on more important meanings than the lessons he had tried to teach them. But what they didn't realize was that the more they chased after success, the more they lost the very thing that had always been there for them: family. William paused, his chest tightening with emotion. This wasn't just a story. This was the truth he had been holding back for so long. The truth that his sons, in their endless pursuit of their own goals, had lost sight of what really mattered. And now they would have to face it. As he continued to write, he thought back to the many nights he had spent in this room, alone with his thoughts, wondering where he had gone wrong. He had always tried to teach Daniel and Robert the value of family, of loyalty, of being there for one another. But somewhere along the way, those lessons had been lost. Was it his fault, he wondered? Had he failed them as a father, or had they simply chosen their own paths, blinded by their ambition? The questions weighed on him heavily, but the one thing he knew for certain was this: he couldn't leave this world without giving them one last chance to understand. The book wasn't just a collection of stories, it was a reflection of their lives, a mirror held up to their choices. And as William wrote, he crafted each scene carefully, making sure that the lessons were clear but not obvious. He didn't want to preach to them, he wanted them to come to the realization on their own. The power of the book lay in its subtlety, in the way the characters slowly unraveled as the weight of their decisions caught up with them. It was a slow burn, the kind of story that wouldn't hit them all at once, but would linger in their minds long after they finished reading. William leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the pages he had written so far. It was almost complete, but there was still one final chapter to write. The chapter that would bring everything together. The chapter that would force Daniel and Robert to confront the truth they had been avoiding for so long. His thoughts drifted to Margaret, and a wave of sadness washed over him. She had been the one who always knew how to bring the family together, the one who had understood the importance of love and connection. If she were still here, would things have been different? William shook his head, pushing the thought away. It was too late to wonder about what might have been. All he could do now was leave behind this final message, this last piece of himself, and hope that his sons would finally see what he had been trying to show them all along. As he wrote the final words of the chapter, his hand trembled slightly, but he forced himself to keep going. This was the most important part, the moment when the brothers in the story would realize what they had lost. And in that moment, standing in the empty house that had once been filled with love and laughter, the brothers understood. They had spent their lives chasing things that didn't matter, and in doing so, they had lost the one thing that had always been there for them, their father's love. But by the time they realized it, it was too late. The house was silent, and their father was gone. All that remained were the memories of what could have been, and the regret that came with knowing they had let it slip away. William set the pen down, his heart heavy with emotion. He had done it. The book was finished. It wasn't perfect. No book ever was. But it was exactly what it needed to be. A reflection of his life, his love, and the lessons he had tried so hard to teach his sons. But would they understand? That was the question that haunted him. Would they read the book and see themselves in the pages? Or would they dismiss it as the ramblings of an old man? He hoped, with every fiber of his being, that they would take the time to read it, to truly understand what he was trying to say. But he knew his sons too well. Daniel, always busy, always in a hurry, might skim through it, missing the deeper meaning entirely. And Robert, with his intellectual mind, might dissect it from a philosophical standpoint, never realizing that it was about him. And yet, despite his doubts, William had faith. He had to. This was his last chance to reach them, his final act as their father. If they couldn't see the truth in the book, then maybe they would never understand. The next morning, William called his lawyer, Thomas, a man he had trusted for years. Thomas had handled all of William's affairs after Margaret's death and had always been discreet and respectful of William's wishes. "I need you to come by the house," William said, his voice steady. "There's something important I need to discuss with you." Thomas agreed, and within the hour he was sitting in William's study, listening carefully as William explained his plan. The book, he explained, was to be given to Daniel and Robert after his death, along with a letter he had written for each of them. The will, which they would no doubt be expecting to reveal their inheritance, would instead direct them to the book, the real inheritance he was leaving behind. Thomas nodded, understanding the gravity of what William was asking. He had seen families torn apart by greed and misunderstanding before, but there was something different about William's approach. This wasn't about money, it was about love. "I'll make sure everything is in place," Thomas said, his tone serious. "They'll get the book when the time comes." William smiled, a small, sad smile. He knew that the end was near, but he wasn't afraid. He had made peace with his life, with the choices he had made, and with the knowledge that he had done everything he could to leave behind something meaningful. That night, as William lay in bed, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. The book was finished, the plan was set, and now all that was left was to wait. He had kept his promise, to himself, to Margaret, and to his sons. What they did with that promise, however, was up to them. It started with the small things. William had always been meticulous about his routine. Up by 6 a.m., a walk around the garden, breakfast, and then a few hours in his study. But one morning he struggled to get out of bed. His legs felt like lead, and the room spun around him. He dismissed it at first, chalking it up to age and fatigue. But as the days passed, his body betrayed him more frequently. The dizziness worsened, and his hands, once steady and precise, began to shake uncontrollably. His breath grew shallow with even the smallest exertion, and the stairs he used to climb with ease became an insurmountable challenge. William knew what was coming. He could feel it in his bones, the inevitable conclusion that he had prepared himself for. The end was near. One morning, as he sat in his study, a sharp pain shot through his chest, and he had to grip the edge of the desk to steady himself. His vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he might fall, but he forced himself to take slow, deep breaths. He couldn't afford to collapse, not yet. There was still something he had to do. The book was finished, but William had one final task: to write the letters to his sons. With trembling hands, he picked up his pen and began to write. "Dear Daniel," the letter began, "I've watched you grow into the man you are today, with a mix of pride and sorrow. You've accomplished so much in your career, but in your pursuit of success, you've lost sight of something far more important: family. I know you're always busy, always chasing the next big deal, but life isn't measured by the deals you close or the titles you earn. It's measured by the moments you share with the people you love. I hope you'll take the time to read the book I've left for you. It's my final gift, and I believe if you read it with an open heart, you'll find the answers you've been searching for." William paused, his breath shallow, his chest tightening again. He set down the pen for a moment, allowing the wave of pain to pass before picking it up again. "Dear Robert," he wrote next, "you've always been the thinker, the one who questions everything, the one who searches for meaning in the abstract. But sometimes in your search for answers, you miss what's right in front of you. I know you're a man of ideas, but I hope you'll take the time to reflect on the life you've built. There's more to life than theories and philosophies. It's the connections we make, the love we give and receive, that truly matter. I hope the book I've left for you will help you see that." With the letters finished, William folded them carefully and placed them in envelopes, his hands shaking as he sealed them. He knew he didn't have much time left, but the weight of the letters in his hands gave him a sense of peace. His sons would receive his final words, and with any luck, they would finally understand. He called Thomas again, the lawyer who had become one of his few confidants in these final months. "It's ready," William said, his voice weaker than before. "The book, the letters, they're all ready." Thomas promised to handle everything after his passing, and with that assurance, William felt a strange sense of relief. He had done everything he could. The rest was up to his sons. The decline was rapid after that. Within days, William found himself unable to leave his bed. His strength had left him, and even breathing felt like a monumental task. The once vibrant man who had filled his days with reading, writing, and contemplation was now confined to the silence of his own thoughts. But he wasn't afraid. William had made peace with his life. He had loved, he had lost, and he had given everything he could to his family. Now all that was left was to let go. One cold morning, as the frost began to creep across the window panes, William Hartman passed quietly in his sleep. There was no grand final moment, no words of wisdom spoken at the last breath. He simply drifted away, leaving behind the house that had once been filled with laughter and love, now silent and still. The call came to Daniel and Robert in the middle of their busy lives. Daniel was in the middle of a negotiation for a high-profile client when his phone buzzed with the message from Thomas. "Your father has passed. Please come to the estate for the reading of the will." Robert received the same message while reviewing papers for his students, and though both brothers were shaken by the news, neither of them dropped what they were doing immediately. There was no rush. Their father had already been gone from their lives for a long time. When they finally made their way to the estate a few days later, there was a heavy silence in the air. The house, once a symbol of their childhood, now felt cold and unfamiliar. They hadn't spent more than an hour there in years, and the walls seemed to echo with the absence of the man who had lived there. Thomas greeted them in the study, the room that had once been their father's sanctuary. The desk was cleared, save for a few personal items, and Thomas sat behind it, a somber expression on his face. "Thank you both for coming," he said quietly. "I know this is a difficult time, but your father left specific instructions regarding the reading of his will. Before we begin, I need to give you something." Daniel and Robert exchanged a glance, both of them unsure of what to expect. They had come here thinking it would be a simple matter, a discussion of the estate, the division of assets, and then they would return to their lives. But Thomas's tone suggested something more. From the desk drawer, Thomas pulled out 2 envelopes, each labeled with their names in their father's handwriting. "These are letters from your father," he explained. "He wrote them before he passed. I think you should read them first." The brothers took the envelopes, their expressions unreadable. Daniel hesitated for a moment before tearing open his letter, while Robert unfolded his more carefully, his eyes scanning the page with a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. The letters were brief, but they carried the weight of a lifetime. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he read his father's words. "You've accomplished so much in your career, but in your pursuit of success, you've lost sight of something far more important. Family. I hope you'll take the time to read the book I've left for you. It's my final gift, and I believe, if you read it with an open heart, you'll find the answers you've been searching for." The words hit Daniel harder than he expected. Had he really lost sight of what mattered? He had always thought he was doing the right thing, working hard, providing for his own family, making something of himself. But his father's words made him question everything. Was it possible that he had been blind to the one thing that truly mattered? Robert's reaction was quieter, more introspective. "You've always been the thinker, the one who searches for meaning in the abstract. But sometimes in your search for answers, you miss what's right in front of you. I hope the book I've left for you will help you see that." He folded the letter carefully, his mind racing. His father had always been wise, always seeing things that others missed. But Robert had never expected his father to see him so clearly. Thomas cleared his throat, pulling the brothers from their thoughts. "Your father left behind a book," he said, sliding a leather-bound manuscript across the desk. "It's not published, and it wasn't meant for the public. He wrote it for you." Daniel and Robert stared at the book in silence, neither of them reaching for it. The weight of the moment pressed down on them, the realization that this wasn't just about money or property. It was about something far deeper. They had come expecting an inheritance, but what their father had left them was something far more valuable. Finally, Robert reached for the book, his fingers brushing the worn cover. He opened it to the first page, and as his eyes scanned the words, his heart sank. It was a story about 2 brothers, a reflection of their own lives, their own choices, laid bare in a way that was both brutal and honest. There were once 2 brothers, both born to a man of great wisdom and love. The father had built a life for them, had given them everything they needed to succeed, and yet, as the years passed, they began to drift away from him. They believed they had outgrown their father, that their lives had taken on more important meanings than the lessons he had tried to teach them. But what they didn't realize was that the more they chased after success, the more they lost the very thing that had always been there for them: family. Daniel felt his throat tighten as he read over Robert's shoulder. This was them. There was no mistaking it. Their father had written this story for them, about them, and suddenly the distance they had maintained, the indifference they had shown, seemed monstrous in the face of the love their father had tried to give. Every page they turned was like a mirror, reflecting their own failures, their own selfishness. The brothers in the story chased after success, built their lives on ambition and intellect. But in doing so, they had lost their father. And by the time they realized it, it was too late. The room grew colder as the brothers read in silence, their father's words echoing in their minds. They had come here expecting wealth, expecting to divide up an estate, but what they had received instead was something far more powerful, a reckoning. When they finished the book, neither of them spoke. The silence in the room was suffocating, filled with the weight of their father's final lesson. William Hartman was gone, but his message was clear. Family mattered more than anything else, and they had failed to see it until it was too late. Thomas sat quietly watching them, knowing that the reading of the will was no longer the most important part of this meeting. The true inheritance had already been given. The brothers left the estate that day, not with wealth or possessions, but with the knowledge that they had lost something far more valuable. Their father had been right all along, and now they had to live with that truth. The drive home was silent. Daniel and Robert sat in the car, the weight of their father's words hanging between them like an invisible barrier. Neither of them spoke, both lost in their own thoughts, replaying the moments they had shared with their father, the ones they had missed, the ones they had taken for granted. The realization that they had misunderstood their father for years was like a slow burn, gnawing at the edges of their consciousness. They had come to the estate expecting an inheritance, something tangible they could divide and walk away with. What they had received instead was far more difficult to reckon with: guilt, regret, and the unsettling truth that they had failed their father in ways they hadn't even realized. As they pulled up to Daniel's house, he turned off the engine but didn't get out. For a long moment, he sat there staring at the steering wheel, his mind swirling with thoughts he couldn't quite put into words. "I can't believe it," he finally muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe we didn't see it." Robert nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on some distant point outside the window. "He was always there. He always tried. And we didn't care." The words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time in years, the brothers felt the full weight of their indifference. Every rushed visit, every excuse, every missed moment, they all came flooding back, stark in their clarity now that it was too late. "Do you think he knew?" Daniel asked quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "Do you think he knew we'd never change?" Robert shook his head, his brow furrowing as he thought back to their father's last days. "He hoped. I think that's why he wrote the book. He wanted us to realize it on our own. But we didn't." The silence that followed was deafening. The brothers were left to confront a painful truth. They had been so focused on their own lives, their own success, that they had lost the man who had always been there for them. And now they would never have the chance to make it right. Days passed, and though they tried to return to their routines, both Daniel and Robert found it impossible to shake the gnawing guilt that had settled deep within them. Daniel sat in his office, staring at the contracts and legal briefs piled on his desk, but he couldn't focus. The words blurred together, meaningless in the face of what he had lost. For the first time in his life, he questioned whether any of it really mattered. He had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, fighting for success, but at what cost? His father had been right. He had sacrificed the one thing that truly mattered for achievements that now felt hollow. Robert, too, found himself struggling to find meaning in his work. The lectures he gave to his students, the papers he graded, it all felt distant, detached from the reality of what he had learned in those final moments with his father's book. He had spent so much time searching for answers in philosophy, in abstract ideas, but his father's message had been clear. The real answers were right in front of him, in the relationships he had neglected. One evening, a week after their father's funeral, the brothers found themselves back at the estate, standing in the now empty house. The rooms felt hollow, echoing with the absence of the man who had once filled them with life. As they walked through the halls, their footsteps reverberating off the wooden floors, Daniel stopped in front of their father's study. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. The desk was cleared, the shelves neatly organized, but there was something missing, something he couldn't quite place. "Do you remember how we used to sit here for hours?" Daniel asked, his voice quiet. Robert nodded, stepping up beside him. He loved this room. It was his sanctuary. Daniel ran his fingers along the edge of the desk, a flood of memories washing over him. He remembered the times he had come home from college, the late nights when his father would sit there, offering advice, listening to his ambitions with pride. But over time, those visits had grown fewer, the conversations shorter. And now, standing in the room, Daniel realized just how much he had missed. "I thought I had time," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "I thought I could always come back." Robert placed a hand on his brother's shoulder, his own eyes brimming with unshed tears. "So did I. But we were wrong." The regret was suffocating, filling the room like a thick fog. They had lost the man who had always believed in them, and now all they had were the remnants of the life he had left behind. As they prepared to leave the house one last time, Thomas arrived, carrying a small box. "There's one more thing," he said, his tone serious but kind. "Your father left this for both of you. He asked me to give it to you after you had read the book." Daniel and Robert exchanged a glance, curiosity flickering behind their grief. What could their father have left them that he hadn't already given? Thomas handed them the box, and Daniel opened it slowly, revealing two items inside, a watch and a key. The watch was old, the leather strap worn with age, but it was familiar. Daniel picked it up, his heart clenching as he realized it was the watch their father had always worn. He had never seen him without it, and now it was in his hands, a symbol of the time they had lost and could never get back. Robert took the key, examining it with a puzzled expression. "What's this for?" Thomas smiled faintly. "It's for the family cabin. Your father wanted you to have it." The cabin. It had been years since either of them had thought about it. The place where they had spent their summers as children, where their father had taught them to fish, to build a fire, to appreciate the simple things in life. The cabin was a symbol of everything they had forgotten. "He wanted you to go there," Thomas continued. "He believed that the two of you would find what you needed there, closure, perhaps, or maybe just a way to reconnect." The following weekend, Daniel and Robert made the drive to the cabin. It was a long, winding road through the mountains, and as they approached the familiar landscape, memories flooded back. Memories of a simpler time when their family had been whole and the world had seemed full of endless possibilities. The cabin was exactly as they remembered it, small, rustic, nestled in the woods by the lake. The air was crisp, the scent of pine filling their lungs as they stepped out of the car. Inside, the cabin was frozen in time. The old furniture, the family photos on the walls. It was as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The brothers spent the weekend there, talking for the first time in years, really talking, about their father, about their childhood, about the mistakes they had made. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the guilt threatened to overwhelm them, but slowly they began to heal. They found their father's old fishing rods in the shed, dusty but still usable, and for the first time in decades, they went down to the lake and cast their lines, just as they had done with their father so many summers ago. It wasn't the same, but in a way it was enough. As they sat by the fire that night, watching the flames dance and crackle, Daniel turned to Robert, his voice soft but steady. "I think Dad knew this would happen," he said. "I think he knew we'd end up here." Robert nodded, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "He always knew what we needed, even when we didn't." The final twist wasn't in the book or the will. It was in the lesson their father had left behind. He had known that it wasn't wealth or material possessions that would bring them peace. It was time, time to reconnect with each other, time to reflect on what truly mattered. And though they couldn't go back and change the past, they could honor their father by moving forward, by living the life he had always wanted for them, one filled with love, family, and connection. As the fire burned low, Daniel and Robert sat in silence, the weight of their father's final gift settling over them like a blanket. They had been given a second chance, and though their father was gone, his legacy lived on in them.